at Dartmouth College. Thank you, Sarah. I'm a climatologist at Dartmouth.
Current chair of the Upper Valley Adaptation Work Group, which is one of the two hosts of tonight's meeting on planning for a just, prosperous, and resilient future for the Upper Valley with climate change migration. And I'm really excited about tonight's conversation for many reasons, but two in particular I want to highlight. One is that, too often when we talk about climate change, usually when I'm talking about climate change to a group like you all, I'm talking about some pretty bad news for the next several decades and ways that we could potentially minimize or reduce that bad news. But it's pretty bad stuff, right? But climate change migration allows us to talk about climate change in a more positive perspective because there are some real positive opportunities that come along with climate change migration to the Upper Valley. Now, there are a myriad of challenges as well. And we're going to talk about these challenges that span a whole host of different topics over the course of this evening. But as we do so, I want to try and balance that discussion with not just the challenges, but also thinking about the opportunities that come along with climate change migration. So that's one reason. The second reason I'm excited about tonight is that this is really the beginning of the conversation for me personally and for a lot of us in this room tonight. So I think for me, I'll speak personally, I didn't really think a whole lot about climate change migration until about the last year when a combination of increasing headlines from around the country about climate change impacts from drought and wildfires and hurricanes, combined with the headlines we were seeing about COVID migration to the Upper Valley and the things that we were experiencing here in these communities with migrants coming associated with COVID. And so this is really the beginning of the conversation for us. It allows us to think about, a shared vision, trying to develop a shared vision for what we think and what we want the Upper Valley to look like in 10 years, 20 years, 50 years into the future. And begin that process now of having these discussions so that we have a better chance of actually achieving that vision together. So tonight we want to ask questions, we want to listen, and we want to keep in mind that this is just the very beginning of this conversation. And I hope it's the first of many conversations on this topic for years to come. So I'll give you a quick overview of the agenda. You can see that on the left side of the screen. We're going to begin the first half of the evening with a group of expert speakers. You can see Elena, Megan, Erica, and Jason. Elena's going to begin with a sort of an overview of the topic of climate change migration, some of the challenges and opportunities we're talking about. Megan is going to talk about her perspective from a regional planning commission and thinking about some of the planning that's involved in all of these topics that we'll be discussing. And then Erica and Jason are going to talk more about the economic side of things, which includes many of these economic opportunities that we might think about with climate change migration. And then in the second half of the evening, we're going to have an opportunity to have much more personal conversations. We're going to break you into groups of 3 into Zoom breakout rooms where you can have 20 minutes to discuss with one another, what are the key conversations that need to be happening now in order to properly plan for this future, and who needs to be part of those conversations. So we'll do that, and then we'll have an opportunity to come back together and discuss reflect on the conversations that we had and share with one another. If this is the first time that you've been to a UVA event, if you haven't been to one of our forums in the past, I want to give you a quick introduction to what the UVA organization is. So we were established back in 2011, and UVA is really a network of organizations, organizations in industry, in academia, in state municipal agencies, nonprofits, all of whom are interested in making the Upper Valley a more climate resilient community. And so we have been holding usually 2 public forums on some topic of climate change and climate change adaptation over the past decade. And so this is our fall forum, which has this topic this year on climate change migration. Finally, a couple Zoom logistical issues. So what we'd like is for folks, and it looks like folks are doing an awesome job of this already, so thank you. Try and keep yourself muted when you're not speaking. And most of the time that you'll be speaking will actually be in the second half of the evening in those breakout rooms. You will have opportunities to ask questions of all of our speakers, and what we'd ask you to do is to pop those questions into the chat. And that's not just to sort of reduce crosstalk across the Zoom here, but it also allows us to record all of the questions that are here, including questions that we might not have time to get to. So as the speakers are speaking, feel free to pop questions into the chat, and then we'll have opportunities for the speakers to respond to those questions. And I think that's it. So without further ado, I'd like to pass it over to Elena, who's going to give us an overview of climate migration.
Thank you, Eric. It's a pleasure to be with you all this evening. So I'm the one that had the request to do this little survey at the beginning to create what's called a word cloud to get a sense of where people's heads were at coming into this space and what words were coming up for people when you think of the phrase climate migration. And particularly, I was interested to see the breakdown, and this is the first time I'm seeing it, so I'm reflecting on it on real time with you all, is how many of these words are about, are sort of fear-based versus how many are opportunity-oriented. Because for a lot of people, we're seeing, I'm delighted to see that opportunity is one of the big words in the middle. But I think also you see words like stampede, you see words like despair, desperate, and that's totally normal. This is a topic that I think engenders a lot of anxiety in some people, but I think the more that I've learned about it, the more I'm starting to see it as a real opportunity for us to begin planning towards a future that many of us want to see and are working towards anyways, and this is just one more leverage point. So with that, I'm going to ask Sarah to stop sharing, and I will share my screen from the beginning. So again, as an intro, my name's Elena Mahaly. I'm a lawyer. I'm a director of Conservation Law Foundation in Vermont. And I'm really honored to be able to just frame up for you all kind of the concept of climate migration. What is it and why is it worth planning for? Just really simplistically, climate migration is really about how there are parts of the country that are becoming uninhabitable. They are inundated with wildfires, flooding, extreme drought, extreme heat, storm surge, tornadoes, and folks are starting to see other parts of the country that are not suffering from these things, like our little neck of the woods in Upper Valley, and it looks pretty nice here. We are really in a positive place when it comes to many of the impacts of climate change. Certainly, we are not unscathed. We have our own issues, but generally speaking, we have open space, we have clean air that's, for the most part, unimpeded by wildfires, although many of us suffered last summer from some pretty smoky days. We are safe from sea level rise and storm surge, being not on the coast. We have plentiful groundwater resources, although I put a question mark here too, because we are experiencing drought in some parts of our states. And we're relatively close to some metro areas. So we do have attractive amenities in this region. And the reason why I started thinking about this is I work at CLF, as I noted, which is an environmental advocacy organization working on a myriad environmental issues in New England. And one of the things that we are focusing on is climate change and how we can best prepare our region to thrive in the face of the climate impacts we know are already here and coming down the pike. And I started thinking about how I really saw our region as a haven for potential climate migrants that were leaving other parts of the country that were becoming more and more challenging to live in for a number of reasons related to climate. And how are we thinking about that from a natural resource perspective? How are we going to put in place and ensure that we have the regulatory and mechanisms and policies to protect the things that we love about our region, and really do so in a way that we're ready to accept those people with open arms and feeling less threatened because we've put in place the safeguards we need to keep things thriving like we like it in our region. So as I started thinking about this, I worked with a journalist back in 2019, I think, at Vermont Digger to sort of like plant this idea of like, you know, thinking about it as an opportunity Vermont at the time was actually paying people to try and move to Vermont, and trying to reverse our population trend. And so we looked at whether climate migration could be an opportunity to reverse that trend. And the story profiled 3 Vermont families that had recently moved, 2 from out west in Montana due to wildfires, and 1 from Washington, D.C., citing the abundant groundwater and resilient communities in Vermont. So we just started to sort of think about it back in 2019. Then we started noticing that more and more stories were popping up in larger stream media sources. The New York Times wrote this piece on how climate migration was going to be reshaping America. And I noticed that pretty much every time that climate migration was written about nationally, our region was talked about, whether it was the Northeast, Vermont, New Hampshire. All of these stories were kind of citing that these once chilly places like Vermont will become more temperate, verdant, inviting. And even NHPR did a piece a little bit less than a year ago on how climate change is starting to drive migration to New Hampshire. And I think over and over again, I got contacted just because I started thinking about this issue, but a lot of people were asking, well, where's the data? Who exactly is going to come here? How many people are going to come here? And we struggled to really come up. There was some research around like larger demographic shifts in the country over time, but there really wasn't super good data yet on where people were moving based on climate change per se. But then along came the pandemic, and we started asking like, I wonder what we can learn in terms of climate migration through COVID migration and how people are moving because of COVID, and whether that may have some indication for us about changes to come related to climate. And there is some data that folks are collecting about where people are moving that's pulled from various sources. You know, this is just looking at USPS change of address requests, but you can see green is places that more people are moving to, and you see that our region is green in this map. There's some really fascinating research going on at Middlebury. Professor Peter Nelson is doing some work to look at cell phone data to see where folks are moving in the region. On the left is April 2020, on the right is October, I believe. The top of my screen's cut off, but as you can see, green indicates people are moving towards that region. And so on the left, you see Vermont is entirely red, but on the right, there's some green patches. And on the right, New Hampshire has a lot more green as well. So there is some indication that folks are definitely moving into this region. And as Eric noted, we're all feeling that too, anecdotally. We also have some data in terms of who's moving, looking at the research around migration patterns writ large. Evidence shows that for the most part, people with means have the capacity to move first. And we're seeing this bear out in some of the research around who's moving during COVID as well, that it is those with more means that are able to come to this region in particular. You can see Vermont is very, very dark purple. And what's the impact? You know, again, the media likes to sensationalize things. And so we did see pieces in the New York Times over the period of the pandemic highlighting small Vermont towns that were inundated with outsiders and faced all kinds of tensions like increased bear complaints, plumbers being booked until Christmas, and no one following the rules at the dump. But when you looked at underneath the hood and sort of got more intimate and looked at the profiles that other more local newspapers were doing, you saw that these were really interesting folks, young families from all over the country, deciding to move to Vermont to bring their resources, their brain power, their economic pocketbooks, and their energy to join the community. there was a Vermonter poll that was done interviewing 230 people who had moved to Vermont during COVID, and they asked if folks were going to stay. And interestingly, more than 1/3 of them said that they were likely or very likely to stay, in large part because the jobs that they had gave them the flexibility to do so. And they cited two attributes that kept them there, being landscape, environment, community, and safety, which I pull up this slide again, going back to what we had hypothesized were the reasons why people would want to come for climate reasons. They're similar to the reasons that people came here under COVID too. And so I think for some folks, what was going on is that they were kind of on the edge of thinking about moving for climate reasons, and then the ability to work remotely, the pandemic kind of sprung them over the edge. And the question is whether we are planning for climate migration. And in short, not really, at least not directly. I'm more familiar with the Vermont side, and that's where the state that I work in. And I know that our 2018 hazard mitigation plan did identify in-state migration as a possible future climate change concern, but really doesn't give it more than a passing mention. We are also working through a massive public process to develop a climate action plan, and climate migration really isn't coming up per se. You know, we're addressing it through some other indirect means, but we do have evidence that folks want us to be planning around this. We paid to have this question put into the 2020 Vermonter poll, asking all Vermonters who were polled, do you feel action should be taken in Vermont to prepare for climate migration? And a majority of them said, yes, we do. So go UVA. Really grateful that you all are having this forum, because these are really, really cruxy issues that are super important to be talking about early. There's lots of opportunity, as I noted, to get an injection of capital, energy, vitality into our towns, to spend ARPA or infrastructure bill dollars towards the kinds of housing, sewer, other infrastructure projects that we need to be investing in anyways. There's opportunity for reforming our land use bills, and certainly, I think, above all, to continue to identify and address the structural, social, and racial inequities that are already existing in our housing, healthcare, access to amenities. All of that is paramount in this planning process as well. So I want to end with this slide, which is I'm so grateful the Valley News publicized this forum through an article, but I just took a little bit of issue with the way that it was the headline for it. And I just thought I would end by reframing how I would have phrased it, which is not that we are warning the Upper Valley that something bad and scary is coming down the pike, but actually we're sharing with the Upper Valley that yes, it's a likely destination for climate migration, but it's an opportunity, a real opportunity for us if we plan for it. So thank you for letting me tee this issue up, and I will let you all move on to further discussion and digging into the planning.
Great, thank you, Elena. And so if you have any questions for Elena, we have some time now for questions. We've got about 8 minutes here set aside for any questions for Elena on climate migration writ large. You can pop those into the chat and I'll read them aloud and give Elena a chance to respond. So Mary has a question. What explains that climate migration still seems to be a secondary state issue?
Yeah, I think it's like many issues that aren't maybe right in front of our face. Sometimes they don't rise to the level of us planning for them, the like when they're farther out on the horizon. So I think that's one reason why we're not seeing it more definitively mentioned as a planning objective. But I think frankly, another reason is like less problematic. And it's just that we are tackling a lot of the issues that we're concerned about with climate migration under the guise of resilience and climate adaptation. So something like smart growth and like where are we developing and trying to kind of keep our development more into downtown centers. Like that is work that we want to continue doing, and that is important in the face of more people coming here, because we don't want people necessarily to be buying their own large open space plots and fragmenting our forests. So there's work, I think, on the ground right now that's already happening that's just under different auspices and isn't tagged as necessarily climate migration work, but is the kind of thing that we're wanting more to see more of.
Yeah, great question, Mary. Sarah Riley asks if you can get a little more specific about some examples of actual opportunities that we should be looking for with climate migration.
Yeah, I mean, I knew that I was probably going to defer some questions because I'm the first speaker and you're about to hear from folks who are going to be talking about economic development opportunities and planning opportunities from the planning perspective. So I happen to have an environmental lens on things. So I would just reiterate that I think really some opportunities are around making sure that our natural resources are protected. So one specific example in Vermont is that we have a lot of people that are competing, and more people will start competing for surface water usage. We don't think of the East Coast as a place that's like limited. That's more of like the water wars of the West. But truly, I mean, we started to see wells run dry in this region. And so I think right now there's a real regulatory gap on how we let or don't let certain large entities draw out water from one basin to another. Take a ski resort that might want to make snow. Right now, there's very little regulation over your capacity to do that, and sort of what are the impacts on wildlife and humans when you draw large quantities of water from one basin and carry it over to another. So that's one specific example of where I see at least an opportunity from a natural resource protection standpoint to kind of put a little bit more groundwork on how we share this public trust resource like groundwater and surface water.
Great. Can you quickly clarify what you meant by the Act 250? Just expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, so Vermont has a pretty unique land use law called Act 250 that is decades old, and it's a law that basically requires development that meets certain thresholds to get a permit from one of several district commissions. And it has been used as a check in Vermont to some degree on development. So there are certain standards that need to be met in order to get a permit. For example, from an environmental perspective, you have to show that there's no undue adverse air quality concerns or water quality concerns with the project or traffic. And it is a tool that many people use to try and curtail unwise development that may have a deleterious impact on our environment, on our communities. But frankly, many people have been saying that this law passed almost more than 50 years ago is due for reform. And particularly, there are advocates that say that we should be more strategic about where in the state we are advocating for development. So we want to maybe make it easier to develop in certain places and harder to develop in certain places. And that goes for everything from housing to renewable energy development to areas that we really want to protect from a climate resilience perspective, and maintaining our large forest areas, maintaining our river corridors to be robust from a flood protection standpoint. So I anticipate that, I mean, every year in the legislature, the last couple of years, there's been efforts to reform Act 250. And I see this as just one other kind of reason to revisit our development laws, because I do think we are going to see more development pressure as a state overall.
Okay, so I've got two sort of related questions I'll join. So a lot of what you talked about seemed to focus on sort of domestic migration. And so we had one question from Lindsay Dearborn asking about how do we think about climate migration from foreign countries, and meeting the moral obligation of more refugee type migration. And then Elizabeth Church was asking a related question, which is what might we learn from current refugee migration that we're already experiencing in this region?
Those are both such good questions. I'll take the second one first, because it's actually a question that we asked. You know, a colleague and I held a forum on climate migration about a year and a half ago at the Resilient Vermont conference, and we asked that question, not specifically about necessarily other refugees coming to Vermont that we can learn, but kind of other influxes of populations at all, because there was also like a big back to the land movement to Vermont as well. And sort of what did we do well when there were like surges of population, and what did we do not so well? And someone in the audience brought up the example of the New Vistas project as well, and how that's a scenario in our collective past where there was a proposal in front of us to have a pretty big influx of people in our region, and how did we respond as a community, and what did we learn about what kind of systems we had in place, and what did we learn about how receptive we were to outsiders. I think it's really important to reflect as a group, and I would encourage everyone in the small groups to think about that, what lessons we've learned from newcomers to date. With regard to the international question, I really haven't devoted energy towards looking at that in particular, other than to say we did not see in the sort of limited data of who's coming to Vermont evidence that we are seeing international climate refugees, specifically tied to climate. So yeah.
Yeah, I think on that issue, one of the topics I've seen is the impact of the late season hurricanes in Central America last year that may have been contributing to some of the migration we saw at the southern border in recent months. And I'd be interested to dig into that a little bit more. And you know, when you talk about data that we can learn or lessons we can learn from how we have received or not refugees, you know, there's a lot of lessons to be learned for how migration has gone in other parts of the country at other times. So looking at like the Southeast US, looking at the Southwest US, which has been growing exponentially. And there's a couple questions about that in the chat, and I can tell people that yes, like this is exactly what we want to do, is look at these other locations that experienced an influx of population. What did they do well? What can we do better? What lessons can we actually take away? What are the similarities and what are the differences? So
yeah, there's actually like a term for that, and we're receiving community. And there's been an entire, you know, nonprofit developed that is just for receiving communities to think through these really challenging topics to try and learn from each other, and do it in a way that feels like it's resonating with the people who are already there and the people who are coming.
Well, thank you, Elena. We're going to wrap it up there and move on to our next speaker, who is Megan Butts. I'll let you introduce yourself, Megan, and share your screen.
Okay. Can everybody see that?
That looks great.
Awesome. Hi, everybody. My name is Megan Butts. I'm the Executive Director at the Upper Valley Lake Sunapee Regional Planning Commission. We are the Regional Planning Commission on the New Hampshire side. If you're in Vermont, you may be familiar with the Two Rivers Ottaquechee Regional Commission, and we are just partner on the other side of the river. I've spoken probably to many of you before, so my role tonight is to plant the seed of planning so that we can have an effective breakout group later, and also to start thinking about what we can actually do to prepare now that we've all been talking about it. So what is planning? So planning is a process where we learn the facts of our current community. We estimate what our future predictions are going to look like. Things like population, what the community might look like in the future, what we might want it to look like. We develop a vision together of what we want the future of our community to look like, and determine goals for that vision. We also then discuss some challenges that may be in the way of achieving that vision, which I saw a lot in the word cloud, some of those challenges, and what would happen if we don't make any changes? What would our future look like? So who is involved in community planning? Well, there's planning professionals like myself and local and regional planners. You also have your local leaders, such as your town managers, your administrators, your planning board members, select board, city councils, businesses, and you, members of the community. Your voice is the most important voice at the table. So the next step in planning is we take all of that information and the goals to determine strategies to reach those goals. So we develop actions that align with those strategies, and then we ask ourselves, are they feasible? Are they impactful? Are they going to make a difference? Is it worth it? If so, who needs to be involved to accomplish this goal? Is this something that can happen in a year, 5 years, 10 years? How much will it cost? Then let's get it done. I saw a comment in the chat earlier about New Hampshire and Vermont, we like to plan, but we don't like to implement. Well, I'm here to say, let's implement too. So when we're talking about climate migration, we're looking at the current state of the Upper Valley and what it looks like right now, and what it may look like with more people coming here. And what can we do today to ensure that we can survive these changes the way that we want the Upper Valley to look like? So planning comes with many challenges, as you may know. It can be a little intimidating at first because we just don't have all the answers. Not yet. But we do know some things, and that's where we should focus. We do know that the Upper Valley is a great place to live. That's why we're all here. That's why we're all on this call. That's why we stay here, live here, work here, and recreate here. We also know that it's very likely that we're going to see an in-migration to our region in the coming years. There's going to be more people wanting to come and live here. There's so much to think about when we think about the future of a community. And sometimes we feel a little bit like this word cloud over here to the right of all these things need to be planned out. Oh my goodness, this seems a little overwhelming. So what questions should we be asking ourselves? Where will people live? What will it look like? How many people can we accommodate? How many people can actually move here and have us still survive? What kind of housing and support services will be needed? Do we have that? We all know that we don't have enough right now. So what would it look like? What would we need? And what do we need to fill the vacant jobs that we have in our region and create sustainable economies? How can we incentivize all types of people to work here to ensure a stable local economy? Do we want to incentivize different industries like Elena touched on? Or do we want more people to live here? And who do we need to fill the positions that we have and to build upon ourselves? How do we stay resilient throughout this? Because we are also impacted by climate change. And also important is, what are we missing? That's what I'm hoping to get out of tonight is, what are we missing? What are we not thinking about? And what should we be thinking about? So with that said, there are so many opportunities that we have right now. And the time is now to start thinking about it. So we are very lucky to have the forethought and knowledge that we do today that our region will most likely experience an increase in population over the coming years. And we have the great opportunity to start planning now so that we can inform how to best welcome this in-migration while making the Upper Valley the best place to live, work, and recreate. So what can we do? How can we take this opportunity to plan and implement changes to welcome transportation? Is our current system able to accommodate more people? Yes or no? Land use. How do we want to build? Where do we want to build? The density of downtowns versus rural sprawl. We have a voice now to help inform how we want our communities to new funding. Should we be planning now? Where should we develop? How do we do it sustainably? And equity, how to ensure we encompass and support diversity for our communities and have all of our jobs filled and all of our services sufficient for all of our population. So bottom line, climate migration is going to happen. We don't know exactly how much, but we have an estimate. And how can we take this opportunity to ready ourselves now? And the exciting part is we can shape the planning process as well. And what do we want? So all of us tonight can participate and actually start to inform this planning that's going to be happening. So we can participate in surveys, attend events and forums like tonight, join regional boards or committees to bring knowledge to your communities, join a mailing list. Start planning at the local level, but don't stop there. Take in the regional perspective as well. And planning does not stop at political borders. So I just wanted to throw out a couple of examples of plans. So I'm a planning professional. So when I think of plans, I think of those documents. That's not exactly what I'm talking about, but here are some examples of some of those plans. There's the Keys to the Valley Housing Initiative that I think you've probably heard about. There's regional transportation plans, local master plans, climate action plans, etc. But also planning can be less formal too. There's a culvert that failed. Well, let's plan how we're going to fix it and make sure it doesn't happen again. So I'm talking all different scales of planning, and now is the time to think about it. And lastly, what are regional planning commissions like the Upper Valley Lake Sunapee Regional Planning Commission doing in relation to climate migration? Well, I mentioned the Keys to the Valley regional housing, and we also have a statewide regional housing needs assessment going on. We are working with our bi-state partners over in Vermont to consider climate migration when we're planning for what the housing needs are of the region. We're not just taking past data, we're thinking forward. Today, I actually spoke with our federal delegation in the House on how the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act can help with preparing for migration in the Upper Valley. You know, there's money all over the place, and we are advocating like this is what we're planning for. We want to use our funds to be able to improve what we have to prepare for what's coming, not just fix what's already there, what's already broken. Transportation planning, we focus on multimodal transportation. Not only is that good for the climate, it's also it's more diverse, it helps more people, it keeps us from building super highways in our rural downtowns. Economic development, workforce development programs. These are all programs that when we hear about economic development, oh my goodness, well, there's going to be big giant mall downtown. That's not what it means. There are small programs, local small businesses, entrepreneur programs, workforce. We can keep that going. We also collaborate on local, regional, statewide, bi-state efforts. And we are doing our best along with our partners across the river to make sure that climate migration is considered in all of the planning work that we're doing and not just an afterthought. So lastly, thank you for my few minutes this evening. And I just wanted to hopefully plant the seed of planning so that we can talk a little bit more later. But I did want to just say these are the type of planning professionals and leaders that you may come into contact with in your area. Just as a quick slide for you. And that is it, Eric. That's it for me.
Thank you, Megan. And apologies for those of you who had a little trouble with the video there, but I think the slides were there, so we were able to see everything. You know, it's interesting as Megan and Sarah and Tony and some of the rest of us who were planning this, we kept talking about this. We keep coming back to planning, planning, planning. And it's so important to remember we have these amazing planning professionals who are doing this every day and year after year. And these are the resources that we can use to engage in this particular topic across all of these different issues. So thank you, Megan. If you have questions for Megan, you can plop them into the chat. What we're going to do is move on to Erica and Jay and hear about the economic side of things, and then we'll do a Q&A with all three of them. Okay? So Erica, why don't you please go ahead and share your screen?
There we go.
That
Should
looks
be
great.
up and running.
Yep.
Great. So I'm Erica Hoffman-Keese. I'm the Executive Director at the Green Mountain Economic Development Corporation, or what we call GMEDC. I'm really happy to be here tonight as part of this really incredibly important conversation. Economic development is an area I feel you don't hear from enough in terms of climate change and climate migration. And this is unfortunate because I think that economic development writ large harbors a lot of possibility to feed into those opportunities that people have been talking about. Tonight, I'm going to start with a quick discussion of the regional development corporations, who we are and what we do. Then I'll take a high-level look at some of the opportunities presented by climate migration. And finally, I'll close with an introduction to a business in the Northeast Kingdom that ties together a lot of these things that we're talking about tonight. Okay, and I had problems with this earlier, so my slides are not advancing. There we go. So regional development corporations are nonprofit entities, private with our own board. The two that serve the Upper Valley are Grafton Regional Development Corporation in New Hampshire, which is a 501c3, and Duncan Cooley is the point of contact there, and GMEDC, which is a 501c6. New Hampshire has 10 regional corporations, and GMEDC is one of 12 regional development corporations in the state of Vermont. Our service area covers Orange County and Northern Windsor County. We work in tandem with the planning commissions that you just learned about from Megan. We, on this side of the river, GMEDC is partnered with Two Rivers Ottauquechee Regional Commission. RDCs exist to foster and develop economic vitality and prosperity consistent with the goals of the communities that we serve. We at GMEDC are also contracted by the Vermont Agency of Commerce and Community Development to act as a regional representative for the State Department of Economic Development, connecting our local businesses and municipalities with some of the state resources that are available. To give you an idea of what that kind of looks like, for my day today, I started off in Rochester, Vermont at a project there. They're building a new inn, and there was a permitting question for the installation of a ramp and how that was going to potentially impact an application they were making to a brownfields program. From there, I went over to Bethel, where I visited an EPA brownfields cleanup site at the old Valley Motors dealership. And finally, I rounded out my field visit with a meeting with the Director of Economic Development in Randolph, where we talked about possible state funding and other local support for a brownfield redevelopment project for mixed use, hopefully including some housing. So that's kind of the gamut of what RDCs do on both sides of the river. So my husband also works with Vital Communities. Sarah is with us tonight, as well as Sarah Jackson. And so we spend a lot of time talking about these issues around the dinner table. And when we started thinking about climate migration and opportunity, our discussion kind of fell into a traditional supply-demand sort of a structure, where climate migrants supply some combination of these things: time, energy, money, skills, needs. And not everybody supplies the same of each of those. And we, in turn, living here, have things that we want to see happening in our communities and or our businesses. And I kind of think of that as the demand side in this context. And for tonight, those demands, in my way of thinking, kind of fall into some things that you can look at as opportunities in the short, medium, and long term, starting by asking ourselves, what are we missing in our communities that having more people would help? What do we need right now? What should we have next year? What will be a problem eventually? And these questions can really be applied to any sector, but tonight I'm just looking at specifically more the economic opportunities. And it's good to keep in mind that as I'm talking about some of these opportunities, if climate migration is happening, it can be assumed that climate change is happening. which in and of itself offers some unexpected opportunities as well. So what are those opportunities going to look like? Workforce. I'm getting this one right out there because it's the first one that everyone thinks of. We need more bodies to fill our jobs. Hospitals are canceling procedures. Hotels are closing off rooms. Restaurants are shortening their hours or limiting their seating or both. And businesses aren't able to function efficiently. New construction is scheduled out for 2 years. Some of our clients have backlogs of orders that are up over a year. Employees are incredibly burned out, and a lot of supply chains are failing. So workforce availability is a big issue. While it's a national challenge, here in New England, it's a regional crisis. It was a problem before the pandemic, and it's only gotten worse. So one of the things that the previous presenters have touched on is we should also consider that with more people, we're going to need more housing. This isn't unlike the workforce issue where housing is already a problem. But one of the specific challenges to creating more housing is inadequate construction labor. So more people requiring more housing mean that there will be an opportunity for construction companies to grow and meet this increased demand. So that's an opportunity that will require some of this workforce that will be coming in. And presuming that we too will be facing challenges, changes to the climate and energy use, because the technical expertise of workforce around energy and building technologies needs to change in light of these environmental issues, there's also a big potential area for business growth in light of those as well. One of the things that I faced today also at the inn was looking at developing cost-effective ways to retrofit existing housing stock, revitalizing some of our current housing stock to better meet the evolving environmental impact standards. They had a situation where part of their foundation was in trouble. And when they looked at repairing it the traditional construction route, it was cost prohibitive. But a new technology has come out called shotcrete, which is basically spray concrete that is a great tool for revitalizing old stacked stone foundations. Unfortunately, only 2 or 3 vendors actually use this in the state of Vermont. So increasing the technical expertise of some of our current construction tradespeople would be a huge kind of tool to use in addressing some of these housing challenges that we're facing. Another one, which I was also really happy to see Megan point out, is volunteers. This is an incredibly important short-term demand that people don't often think of as associated with business growth or opportunity. But here in New England, an incredible amount of community work is done by volunteers. And a lot of those volunteer service hours directly support the development of our communities, permitting, zoning, planning, housing, energy, economic development. Those are all volunteer community committees in most cases. So adequate staffing through of a volunteer economic development entity, be that a municipal committee, a chamber of commerce board of directors, or some of our planning boards, and professionalization of some of those processes when possible is actually a significant business opportunity. And that's something that increased population base could support. Not necessarily in the front end where we think of new doors opening or more doors opening on Main Street, but in terms of the economic activity those volunteers in those roles enable. So down the pipeline a bit. Collaboration, another one we've already heard tonight. This is a famous John Donne quote, "No man is an island entire of itself." Climate migration and the causal of climate change, they're too big for any one person, town, state, or even country to successfully address independently. And solutions aren't going to be found in one place or with one person. So working together, leveraging different organizational strengths can increase cost effectiveness and reduce unnecessary redundancies. So one of the other things that we see in terms of benefiting business opportunity or economic opportunity is that climate migration encourages innovation across regions by the transfer of knowledge and technology, that new and different populations bring new and different perspectives and fresh approaches. They use tools differently. They have different tools. So our evolving environment really requires creativity, and mass movements of populations inspires that creativity. So it's a good match. So moving on to the midterm, a really top level concern is food. And that comes from a couple of different places. I just was reading a California story that has to do with water and irrigation for food production. In 2020, this one farm had about 109 crop fields, or whatever you call those round irrigated fields, under propagation. Is that the right word? In any case, cultivation, that's the word I'm wanting. And this year, they have received enough water from the water system to irrigate 13. So that's going to have that kind of impact to water usage and application elsewhere in the bread baskets of our country and other countries, is going to increase demand for foodstuffs. More people mean more food, and at the same time that climate change in the growing regions is decreasing the supply. So here in Vermont and New Hampshire, where we have a very active and robust kind of agricultural sector, this provides a really incredible opportunity for local agriculture and distribution outlets. Secondly, business expansion. That's kind of a no-brainer. More people equals more business, more potential businesses, more patients, more diners, more markets. Those are for existing businesses that are already here, as well as new businesses that are going to be required to meet those demands. A lot of time has been spent on encouraging people to address the workforce housing issue. And just recently, I was talking to someone who really hadn't thought about the impact of the housing issue on his favorite restaurant until they started closing their doors on the weekends when he wanted to go to eat. So it's when those kinds of things start reaching into people's comfort zones, that's when you have an opportunity to promote the benefits of something like climate migration. And third is technical expertise diversification. That's a lot of syllables to basically talk about how old technical expertise can be applied in new places and in new ways. While some of this business opportunity is enabled more by climate change rather than climate migration, both those occurrences are going to provide opportunities for businesses and individuals to apply expertise they already have, but outside of their regular markets. An example might be a plastics manufacturing firm that's installing weather forecasting software, kind of like what you might hear about here in a little while from Jay, to better staff their line and production schedule so that they can avoid any weather-related delays in delivery. That's something that maybe they haven't done in the past. The technology's been there, but it hasn't been applied in this sector because the weather, the vagaries of the weather didn't require that kind of a responsiveness. It's a new application for an existing software product, but in a new sector. And the long term, some thoughts to consider. Demographic shift. Right now, our population in Vermont is one of the oldest in the nation. It's right behind Maine and just ahead of New Hampshire. So our neighborhood is hosts an economy that is best suited for wealthy retirees, and the business development has followed the needs of that demographic. So what climate migration is going to afford us is it will bring more different demographic groups to the region. And this will create an opportunity for business development to serve new populations and meet newly evolving needs. Also, more people will be vying for resources, which will require better conflict management tools, including increased use of monitoring and measuring technology so that we can ensure resource quality and measure usage for equitable resource access and allocation. For organizational experts and systems engineers, the consultants among us, this is an opportunity to design access protocol and to encourage fair allocation of scarce resources. So it's a way of applying some of the knowledge that we've used for organizational development to how we create the community that we want when we have a larger number of people vying for a limited amount of different resources, water being one we've talked about already this evening. Some of those will be new business opportunities, but others, and this is, I see some educators here on the call, which is great because a lot of the opportunities we're talking about will require and be an opportunity in of itself for training and education facilities, for either training courses that they host themselves or that become part of an adult education curriculum as we start retooling and reskilling some of our existing workforce as the mix of industrial sectors and skill sets moves. So that's some of the thoughts that I'm bringing to the table, but I thought rather than continuing to talk about them from kind of my perspective as a generalist supporting business development, I wanted to introduce Jason or Jay Schaefer, who's the co-founder, president, and CEO of Northview Weather. I met Jay recently when we were both participating in a consortia proposal for a statewide software development program as a part of some of this ARPA funding. And it struck me that of 8 participating projects, his project from the Northeast Vermont Development Association in the Northeast Kingdom was the only one focused on the climate economy and looking at opportunities for how to start preparing and planning and building a green economy now. And he'll be able to share a little bit more about that potential project. But more importantly, when I started looking at his business and hearing a little bit more about his background, I thought he'd be a terrific voice for this session because he and Northview are really a living model of a lot of what I've just shared. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and turn it over to you, Jay.
Great. Just doing a sound check. Are we okay on that?
Sounds good.
Okay, great. Okay, let me just go ahead and share. All right. Can I just get a thumbs up, Erica, that the slides, when you see them, come up? Okay, great. So just a little bit about my background coming to this. Thanks for inviting me. This is a really interesting opportunity. I love to talk about the work we're doing here. I thought just from my frame, it'd be good to know my perspective here. I was the kid at like age 7 who knew I wanted to be a meteorologist and got my degree in meteorology at Plymouth State and then went on to the University of Utah to get 2 degrees in meteorology. I'd like to call myself a purebred weather weenie or meteorologist. And about 20 years ago, I got a faculty position at Linden State College, which is now Northern Vermont University. And about a decade ago, we started doing research with utilities on extreme weather impacts through another project that was funded, research project. And I was crazy enough to put on the entrepreneur hat. And going into year 4 of owning and operating Northview Weather, I had a founder now. I'll talk more about that in just a second. But we provide extreme weather impacts predictions to the electric grid. And we're roughly in the green and clean technology space. So a little bit about Northview. We are a 4-year-old bootstrap company. So we're not trying to scale or grow fast. We're trying to go slow and steady because I do have a dual role as a faculty position and a tech entrepreneur. And we're based in Northeastern Vermont, which is a challenging place to start a technology company if there's not much of a culture that's there. Some other things about us, we actually have our first patent that was just granted a few months ago, which is a huge step. And then our customers are electric utilities in both transmission and distribution system. And we provide essentially software and consulting services. So whether it's 3 days ahead of a storm, how bad a storm might be for workforce management, do my guys have to work on the weekend? Do I need to pull in extra crews from Nova Scotia? To climate resilience planning, we actually just completed a 2-year study looking at, well, how bad is climate change going to be on the electric grid? For like long-term capital investments. And then we just started doing some more work on asset and vegetation management. Our overhead lines, distribution lines, have about 75% tree cover, which makes them very sensitive and vulnerable to weather in the Northeast. Thought it'd be interesting just to show an example product of some of the things that we do. And we basically take weather information in a customized sense and then map it onto utility assets. And here's the overhead distribution lines for Green Mountain Power, who is a customer of ours, looking at peak wind gusts. This is on this Friday actually, and you can see the winds are coming from the southeast, and you can see the general area where there might be the strongest winds to the lee side of the Green Mountains. So very much operations day to day, looking at the weather. We like to say that we're kind of the first responders to the future in a lot of way to help people act on what's actually coming. And then we also do some stuff with climate, as I mentioned. The left-hand graphic is some work we've done on snow and ice. And that's the ice storm accretion from a 2008 ice storm, which was mostly a southern New England, southern Vermont event. And we've done some work on solar intermittency and snow cover too, right? Solar is a great resource, but it's not really planned well with resource adequacy. And in the wintertime, solar is not something we can rely on for peak load management. We've done some research to kind of show that we just need a lot more storage with solar installation. The big nugget, the big takeaway from this 2-year study is that the electric grid, the next 30 years, we're estimating outages increasing on the order of 10 to 15%. So it's not a 2x, and we've broken that down in different classes. And basically storms are getting warmer and wetter. And because of that, the teeth of those storms, the strength of them is just getting a little bit stronger, whether it's wet snow or whether it's wind or ice. Solar power prediction. This is an example of a 5-day forecast for all the distributed solar plants. This is a synthetic system, but over Windsor County today, we had predicted for all of the peak installations of solar, there was 28 megawatts of power that was being produced, and our forecast had 19.3. Again, this is like kind of experimental research, but this is where some of this technology is going for intermittency and managing day ahead power on the system, is knowing what kind of power you might get based on it being sunny or cloudy. Kind of nascent technology. Utilities basically are innovated through regulation, so it's a difficult place to really move fast in. So a little bit building on what Erica mentioned here, she's one of the partners in this pitched software tech cluster concept, which is led by the Center on Rural Innovation, which is just down the road in Hartford. And it's a larger coalition of a number of higher education learning partners, including the Dolly Lab at Dartmouth, the CAT Coders at UVM, Vermont Tech, Northern Vermont University, and the Community College of Vermont. And then there's a number of communities on this. VSET, Vermont Center for Emerging Technology in Burlington, is going to do some more mentorship programs and a lot of support for innovators and entrepreneurs and co-working spaces, some infrastructure projects in there. I think Brick had a entrepreneur space that they're going to spin up too. And our project is focused on climate tech at NVDA in the Northeast Kingdom, partnered also with Northern Vermont University. So a little bit about climate technology and what this looks like, just a few things on this. Climate technology can roughly be defined basically as businesses that are technology enabled that help to accelerate decarbonization, whether it's technologies like carbon capture or sequestration, whether it's software based, whether it's creating a new type of concrete that's lower carbon. We can kind of broadly categorize it there, but we're really focusing on agriculture. We're focusing on energy, and we're focusing in, sorry, we keep going here. 32 billion was invested in climate tech startups in the country last year, which was like a 3x over the last year. This new carbon economy, once we get a price, social price, and an actual market price in carbon, like how it actually has impacts in the environment, this is going to take off in the next 30 years, easily a multi-trillion-dollar economy. And that could be taking carbon out of the air, reducing emissions. That can be a variety of technologies there. And we could do all those things, and we have to do more than one. We just need to focus on it and make those investments. We need leadership. So we're focused on, forestry, energy, and agriculture. Try to reduce our carbon footprints there in technology enabled spaces. That's our pitch, at least. This is not something we've started. There are other climate tech startups or accelerators such as Greentown Labs in Massachusetts. We're trying to create a Vermont hub or a northern hub of something like that. So a little bit about climate migration, and I'm a meteorologist, but I know enough about climate to be dangerous, I like to say. Blue line is the observation for just Vermont area average temperatures. And then we have two forecasts from a lower emissions and higher emissions scenario. And, it's going to get warmer. We know that. It's hard to make this real on an everyday basis. So just a kind of a cartoon way of thinking about this is, 50 degrees based on calibration on this is roughly equivalent to Hartford, Connecticut, which if we keep on our current path, will be there in the 2060s. For our current climate, just kind of average across the state. And then Philadelphia, Pennsylvania is a few degrees higher than that. So if we kind of stay in business as usual, we aren't putting lots of more emissions in the atmosphere, a lot of Vermont's climate could emulate climate closer to Philadelphia by the end of the century, which is pretty significant. All right, I have one more slide here just to think about these risks. I'm a little bit finished with a little bit of science here. And the confidence is on the y-axis, and the direction of change is on the x-axis. If it's to the right of the dashed line, it's going to increase. And what we find through this work, based on our work, based on the literature, is that Extreme heat is going to become more likely. Cold, we're going to warming climate, so cold is going to be less likely. We're going to have more energy demand, of course, in summertime than the wintertime from that. From electricity standpoint, we know extreme precipitation is getting higher. Eric, I'm sure you've heard that from him and his research, right? That's pretty much a slam dunk. Annual precipitation may not be going up quite at the same rate. And if temperatures are going up a little faster, we might actually have more evaporation and things like seasonal drought. Annual snowfall, eventually we're going to get to a point where we just don't get as much snow, right? Not that snow is going to go away in the next 30 years. It's just we're going to have more thaws. It's winter's not going to be as reliable. So like I said, with drought, it's kind of a lower confidence thing because it's also asynchronous in nature. It takes some time for it to happen. Wet snowstorms, because more of our winter storms are getting wetter and we're going through freezing and thawing cycles more often. Our precipitation is just occurring in a wetter fashion. So our wet snowstorm risk is actually going up the fastest of any of the risks we identified. Windstorms, our work suggests that they're going to also increase, maybe not as high confidence. Hurricanes, God forbid we get a hurricane like 1938 that comes up. We may have, category 3 hurricane making landfall into New England, maintaining strength as a category 1 or 2 hurricane by the time it gets up here. Our current climate is going to support strong storms like that. Warming oceans made fuel for stronger speed limits or higher potential winds. And then ice storms and thunderstorm winds are lower confidence. Ice storms are there's a certain formula you need to have long duration cold air masses. And we see increases in the frequency of like low impact ice, but the high impact ice is not too clear. The same thing with, like a thunderstorm, like gust front or microburst that might happen in thunderstorms. We just don't know it as well. So that was kind of one tour of some of the things that we do and in my world. And, I would just have to say, this is how I feel hope. And I'm just putting my knowledge to work. And I want to dedicate the rest of my career as I can to, just help us get to a lower carbon economy. So thanks for having me today.
Awesome. Thank you to Megan and Erica and Jay for those. We've got a bunch of questions here, so I'm just going to jump right in. We have a question from Nick Holt asking about, sustainability and resilience is already changing how we live, eat, drive, work, travel, and play in ways that really we couldn't have predicted even 24 months ago. So how do we plan and predict what our needs will be so that we can properly plan for this migration, given how quickly things change?
Is that for me or Erica?
Well, it's really for any of you. I don't know if
Megan.
has thoughts on that.
Megan, yeah. I might have to defer on that.
Well, I would have to say that we were not everywhere in the Upper Valley was resilient for this COVID pandemic. We'd still have a lot of work to do, and we learn based on what we've seen so far. And while we do have a great community here and focus local and have a lot of sustainability, you can't say the same thing across every single one of our communities. And what can we do to predict what's going to happen is we can take the information from the experts that we know, and it's better to plan and not get a huge influx of people than to, we already have a housing crisis now. We already have a transportation crisis now. It's kind of all going hand in hand, and we plan for what we can accommodate.
Yeah. Sarah Jackson was asking, I think this is also for you, Megan. So specifically on your list of questions, and specifically when you said, how many people can we take? How do you even get to a number in a question like that? And then what do you do with that number once you get it?
Well, great question. And that's kind of what part of this process is all about. With our Keys to the Valley Housing Initiative, we did a lot of research, collected data, and took population predictions and current predictions to see that we need about 10,000 more houses in the region just to sustain what we think is coming. And that's not even really including what could be coming with climate migration. So we, like I said before, we take the information that we have, and quite frankly, we can't even fill our jobs now. So what do we need to do that? And then some.
Yeah, and that's a nice segue to Kevin Gish's question about housing, which he says seems like a very long pole in this tent. This topic keeps coming up. So building more housing will surely need more construction labor, but these employees need somewhere to live while they build this new housing, and we can't attract new folks if they don't have a place to live. And there was a follow-on point, is it possible to better align development and construction costs with the creation of affordable housing? So, lots going on with housing here, Megan. I don't know if you want to chime in on those.
I think that's just exactly the right way to be thinking. How can we align all of these sectors together versus, we say a lot in transportation. Well, if I got to dig up the road to fix the road base, why don't I fix the sewer underneath too, instead of, doing it multiple times? The same thing with housing. We need to, think about this development and job force and how to make people, or how can we build houses that people can afford to live in all together, as opposed to siloing out all the sectors. I think it's great. That's great points that were made.
A couple. Sorry, somebody.
Can I jump in a little bit?
Yeah, please. Thank you, Erica.
Is one of the things that we've been thinking about, and I know that the Keys to the Valley covers some of this, which I think is really applicable to this question, is that it's doing a lot more work with what we have in the short term, in terms of if there are facilities that are ready to be renovated or kind of revitalized, I guess is a word I would use, versus wholesale building of large new compounds. So it's sort of taking an incremental approach to start getting some of that, some of those housing units constructed, whether they might not be freestanding, it might be apartments in existing homes, it might be ADUs. There's a number of different smaller steps that homeowners now can take to add units to their current property that might be a step in the right direction to start creating some of that foundational housing that can then support, say in this case, more construction people who are coming to help us build the larger projects.
Yeah, and so a couple questions from Jim White. So how likely, I think these are for Jay and Erica, as we think about people coming and potentially filling jobs, being part of the workforce, how likely is it that we're going to get a good match between the people who come and the jobs that need to be filled? And what can we do? I guess a follow-up to that would be, what could we do to promote a better match?
Well, one of the things is knowing what we need, what the current labor workforce needs are. For instance, we know that we have a lot of entry-level openings. So unfortunately, for instance, some of the past experiences is businesses have brought in populations of people, but they can't live here because the housing crisis, of course, is hitting the workforce level of affordability the hardest. So one of the things that I keep going back to is being reminded of the Dust Bowl and what happened with the Dust Bowl when the Dust Bowl migrants picked up with what they had and left and went somewhere new. And they oftentimes didn't have a place to stay. So it's kind of looking at some of these, and I think this goes back to some of the questions about learning from other population migrations that have happened elsewhere in the world, is not looking for the perfect fit now, but looking for a place for people to land that can then they can then be integrated into the community, and in this case, into the workforce. With the training, there's going to have to be a big investment in our training partners, both public education as well as private sector training providers, to help make the training available to build the skill sets in the coming population that would match the workforce needs.
A nice question from Lindsay Dearborn. I haven't heard any mention of our indigenous neighbors, the Abenaki and the traditional conservators of our land and water, and accommodating their legitimate interests in ancestral and sacred land sites. And so I wish Elena was still with us here to chime in on this. I'm not sure if Megan, Jay, or Erica have thoughts on that.
Well, Megan and Jay might be thinking about it. One of the things that I've just started doing, which it is new, I don't know that any of the other RDCs are doing this, is looking to start a collaboration with our local Abenaki populations, because right now we don't even know if in my case, if my mission incorporates appropriately their concerns and their strengths that they can bring to the table. But I think that that's something that we started talking about when the diversity and equity and inclusion question came up. Is like, well, okay, that's true. What are we going to do about incoming populations? But we need to start with the populations that are already here that we aren't working with. And there's a group out of Norwich that we're kind of starting a conversation with around that from the GMEDC perspective. I don't know about the Planning Commission.
Yeah, Megan?
I would think Erica hit the nail on the head, that we are trying as well to focus a little bit more on who is currently here as well, making sure we're reaching all of those populations. In particular, I am not very familiar with our neighbors. And so this is a good opportunity for me to kind of reach out and find out more. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, and I'll say on this topic as well, I've been a part of a group of academics who are trying to do more research on climate migration as part of a NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration grant that's really focused on the economic and social and equity side of things, and interacting with and listening to and understanding better our native communities who are already here is a big part of that. So hopefully we'll have a lot more to talk about in the years to come on that topic. One last question, and then we're going to take a quick break. What about a time frame? So do any of you have thoughts on when we might expect to see large numbers of climate migrants or refugees? And how long do we have to actually do this planning?
I'll jump in here for a second. The one who predicts the future will answer that question. Okay. It's here now, my opinion. And if we had infrastructure, if we had investments in housing, and if we had a properly connected digital broadband, people would be flocking here, hands down, my opinion. And climate change is accelerating, and we're just hitting the gas on that. And even if we do our darn best there's so much warming and impacts that are going to happen in the system. So yeah, I think it's here.
I couldn't have said it better, Jay. I think I agree with you wholeheartedly. So with that, we're going to take a quick break here for 5 minutes, and we'll reconvene at 7:25, and we'll jump into the breakout rooms then. So feel free to turn off your video or whatever you like for 5 minutes. We'll see you back at 7:25. And we're going to post to the chat here a couple of prompts. But the idea here is that, you know, we've had some nice overview talks here, thinking about it from different perspectives, and there's a lot here. But each of you has your own experiences, your own interests, your own expertise to bring to this conversation. And so as you think about this from your community, whatever town that might be in the Upper Valley, what do you think are the most important conversations that need to be happening now on this issue of climate migration? And who needs to be a part of those conversations? So that is your prompt. We're going to break you into these rooms of 3. You should see the breakout rooms pop up, and then you'll have a chance to jump into them. Okay. Really sorry to break up such a great conversation. Thank you for coming back. We all just talked a lot, which is fabulous. Hopefully you had a really enjoyable conversation and a helpful conversation. So what we want to do now is, after all that talking, just take a minute and reflect on the conversation that you just had. And while you do that, please go ahead and post in the chat, you know, what was the big takeaway that you have from your conversation? You know, the one takeaway that you're really going to have as you leave this evening from your conversation. And then post them in the chat and take some time. We're just going to take a few minutes here, and we can all just sort of read what others are posting and reflect on it. And we won't have more content here while we do that. So reflect and post. Well, these are all great. Thank you all for your thoughts and for your engagement here. I'd like to invite now our speakers Erica, Jay, and Megan, perhaps one by one, to sort of reflect on what they're seeing here. Maybe reflect on their conversation in the breakout rooms as well.
I guess I'll jump in and start off with something that came up in our room a little bit, but I'm seeing reflected in some of the chat postings here. Is that there are conversations happening in many communities, but those conversations seem to be happening within the context of the people in the community now, and not necessarily inclusive of what a community might look like in the future. And they're also still, this probably isn't a politically correct way of saying that, but not based in the realities that we're looking at forward at here, but based in kind of some of the calendar pictures that we all have hanging on our walls. It's like the perfection of New England versus the reality of living here. And so there are those conversations happening, which is good. There are people coming to a table, but I think there's a big educational component that's going to be needed to create a message that includes the realities that we're all facing, but maintains the positive spin of what we're trying to do here. That sees it as a constructive evolution as opposed to an evolution being forced by loss. I don't know if any of that made any sense, but
No, it definitely made sense to me. Megan, did you have some thoughts you'd like to share?
Sure, I'm gonna shoot to have the video on if it lets me. Our conversation came back to housing, transportation, diversity, getting some young people to want to stay here. And these are all current issues, whether people move here or not. So that is kind of the focus that I want to leave with is we're not going to have any new problems. If we don't address the current problems that we have now by planning for them, it's only going to exacerbate it when there's more folks moving here. And many people have pointed out, well, it's the people that have the money that will be able to come here first. And quite frankly, there's some of us on this call that will be the ones that get pushed out of here, and that isn't a happy feeling. So, and that's just how we are right now. So I'll leave with that. And also thank you for all of the great ideas that'll help inform my own planning work as well.
Thanks, Megan. Jay, did you have some thoughts you wanted to share?
No, I'm about to turn in here. I'm a little under the weather. I think Erica covered it well. Thank you.
Sure. Well, I'd like to thank all three of our speakers and Elena, who's already dropped off, but thank you all. I'll just reflect a little on what I'm seeing here as well, and then we'll wrap it up with just a couple slides and reminders. One comment that kind of resonated with me was talking about how do we perhaps rebrand the conversation around climate change so that we can converse more constructively, positively with people who might not agree on climate change. And actually, Jay's comment sort of pointed to this as well, that planning can be more of an agnostic topic that doesn't get into some of the thorny issues of other politically charged issues like climate change. And that's one of the reasons why I've been really interested in this topic, is that I see this as a way to go to towns that may have a more politically conservative community who may not be receptive to somebody coming and say, hey, let's create a climate action plan, because they don't want to converse about climate change. But if we can have a conversation about migration and planning for the future and housing and transportation, things that every community is concerned about, and as part of that conversation, we talk about a particular kind of migration, climate migration, and why might people come here? Well, we can see these climate changes happening, and well, what's happening here and what do we need to prepare for here? So we can approach this conversation from a different perspective and a different framework than the one that we've often been doing it, or at least I've often been doing it in the past, which is, starting off, I'm a scientist, so sort of starting off with some of the facts about climate change, which isn't always receptive to people. So I like this idea of rebranding. And to me, part of that rebranding is flipping the problem on its head and focusing on some of the opportunities that come with it. And along the way, we're going to have to deal with all these challenges that we're talking about, like housing, like transportation, like equity, like making sure that the people who are here who don't have a ton of money aren't pushed out by wealthy newcomers. So those challenges will definitely need to be addressed, but this perhaps is a way to broaden the conversation and broaden the audience who's willing to engage in that conversation. So I just want to share my screen and share a last couple slides with a little bit of information for you all. So with all of these forums that we have, I mentioned we do about 2 a year. We always like to try and leave people with some action items, right? Where do we go from here? As I said at the beginning, we want this to be the start of the conversation. This is the first step. And so let's continue this conversation. So you will be hearing more from the Upper Valley Adaptation Work Group, UVA, the group that I'm with and a lot of our speakers here have been associated with. You are already signed up for some of the email list, but you can sign up for the UV Climate Action List as well, which is out of Vital Communities, to learn more about other programming like this and other opportunities to perhaps volunteer. We have a program that is, again, jointly run by UVA and Vital Communities called the Upper Valley Climate Change Leadership Academy. This will be our 3rd year running the Leadership Academy, and we're going to be looking for applicants beginning in January. We'll open up the application then. So you'll be able to click on this link. We're going to send you all these slides. You'll be able to click on this link and see directly what the Climate Change Leadership Academy is all about. And I was pleased to see some Climate Change Leadership Academy alums in the group tonight. You can join one of these volunteer organizations, your local planning board, your zoning boards, your conservation committees, your energy committees. So much important work gets done there, and it only gets done because of the generosity of people with their volunteer time. You can contact your regional planning commission. We heard from Megan tonight. She's on the New Hampshire side. We also had Kevin here, Kevin Geiger, who's associated with the Vermont Two Rivers Ottaquiche Planning Commission on the Vermont side of things. And so we'll make sure that you have their contact information. If you want to reach out about specific people that you should reach out to in your town. The regional planning commissions already work with these people. They already know who is making these decisions. What are the important committees that one should be on if you're interested in contributing to this conversation at the next level, getting involved in the planning itself. And keep having this conversation with other people, with your neighbors, with your friends, with your family. I think this is starting to become a conversation that's happening more and more, but we want to keep this momentum going. So thank you all for joining us. You will, in the days to come, later on this week, you are going to get all of the slides that were presented tonight. We'll make sure you have all of those, including these slides with links to our emails and some of the organizations I just mentioned. You will get a link to a YouTube video of this entire evening, so you can go back and look at that. We'll make sure that the content of the chat is also available for you. You'll have contact info for the speakers, and you'll be on a mailing list so that if there are other opportunities in the coming days, weeks, and months, you'll be able to hear about those as well. So thank you all for joining us, taking a couple hours out of your evening to start this conversation, and we'll look forward to seeing you at the next event. Take care.